So, having studied about the Industrial Revolution, today we are going to study about imperialism. What is imperialism? Imperialism is a system where we see a powerful country, that is, a country which is economically prosperous, technologically advanced, and militarily very strong. It goes on to empower or exercise control over a weaker nation for its own vested interests. The powerful nation which goes on to extend control is known as the imperialist nation, while the weaker nation is known as the colony. A very fine example of imperialism is our very own country, India, which was colonized by the Britishers for their own vested interests to make profits. So that is how they came here, extended their control, started interfering in the political matters, and economically exploited our nation, the colony, to have their own advantages, to lead to the prosperity of their own nation. So we see that imperialism is a system wherein a powerful country will control the weaker nation for its own vested interests. Growth of imperialism. Now, why did this such a system come up? What were the reason behind it? As we have already studied about the industrial revolution, where the factory system comes up, the machines are set up in the factories, which leads to large scale production of goods. Now, therein arises the need for colonies because colonies serve two major purposes. One, they supply the raw materials. Two, they serve as markets for the finished goods. So that is the reason that colonies were required after the industrial revolution to get the raw materials that were required in the factories, and after the goods were manufactured they have to be sold somewhere, so that required markets which were well provided by the colonies. So that is how began the colonization of different parts of Asia, Africa, and America. These were the non-industrialized nations, which were weaker nations, but they were very rich in natural resources. So they could provide abundance of raw material, and they were militarily weak, so they could be easily controlled. So that is how it led to the colonization of these regions to serve as colonies and benefit the imperialist nations, the industrialized nations like Britain, France, Germany, and so on. So we see that basically this imperialism setup, where the imperialist nations go on to acquire colonies or weaker nations, was happening to sustain their industrial revolution. By the end of the 19th century, we see that almost the whole of the non-industrialized region, all this Asia, countries like India, Sri Lanka, China, African regions, they all came under the control of the industrialized European countries like Britain, France, USA. Again, why did these industrialized nations require colonies? To supply them with the raw material and also to serve as the markets that will benefit them, their industries, and lead to more profits. So that is the reason that industrial revolution made the industrialized countries to go on to extend their control over the weaker nations for their own profit. Causes for the rise of imperialism. These are some listed causes which led to the rise of imperialism. First is surplus production. With the coming of the factories, the installing of the machines, now large number of products were produced. So this large scale production of goods had to be sold somewhere. For instance, if we say that population of one region is of 100 people, while production of some commodities 500, so at maximum 100 or 150 or maximum 200 products could be sold in that area. But what about the remaining 300 products? For this, they require a new market where people would be requiring that commodity and they can buy. So that is why when this large scale production is happening, there's these extra products being produced, they require new market, new people where they can sell off this extra large production. So with the large production happening, all the extra surplus production was now being sent to these new colonies to be sold off there and to make profits. So the large scale production, they require new markets, and that is what led to acquire more colonies by the industrialized nations, leading to imperialism. Second was need for raw materials. Now these factories, they required raw materials for the manufacturing of goods. They required, like for producing a cotton cloth, they required cotton, they required wool to produce wool cloth. So this fabric was required. So these raw materials, these were required. They can easily be acquired by these colonies, which are weaker nations, and they are rich in all these natural resources. So to get the raw materials, they required these colonies. Then the pressure of population. As industrial nations grew, they became economically more prosperous. There was in better living conditions. The standard of living increased. So obviously the mortality rate also reduces when the conditions are fine, which led to increase in population. Now, where to accommodate this increasing population? They had limited area, but the population was increasing. So this increasing population had to be accommodated. So in new colonies, these people could be settled. So to meet the demand of the increasing population, to accommodate them, new regions were required. So it also led to or facilitated the acquiring or procuring of new lands by acquiring the colonies, leading to imperialism. Then ardent nationalism. We see at that time, any powerful nation which went on to acquire more colonies was considered to be very powerful. It added to the power and prestige of the imperialist nation that they have so many colonies under them. So that added to that, power and prestige of a particular nation. The more the colonies you have, the more powerful you will be considered. So they began this race among these industrialized nations to acquire more and more colonies. France, the Dutch, the Belgium, Netherlands, England, Germany, everyone wanted to acquire more and more regions, more and more colonies to become a powerful nation. So that is what this race for acquiring more colonies also led to this imperialism. Then development and modern means of transport and communication, with the development and new inventions of steamships, railways, telephone, telegraph. So it became easier to travel to far off distant lands and gain control over them. So this communication network became better. The transportation system became better, which again facilitated in acquiring far off distant new lands, leading to rise of imperialism. Then rise of industrial capitalism. We see that with trade and industrial revolution, the merchants and traders, they were greatly benefiting. They were making huge profits. So they needed place to invest all the surplus, the extra profit that they were making. So they needed to set up new industries, new places. They required to invest more. So this again led to industrial capitalism, which further led to imperialism, that they have to make new investments to make new profits, which further led to acquiring new colonies. Then geographical discoveries and exploration. As we have already studied, the voyages and the explorations that happened since the time of Renaissance led to the discovery of new lands. New African route to Africa was found, to America was found by Columbus, by Vasco da Gama. They discovered the route to India. So there was discovery of new lands, new routes, new places, which they went to acquire. So there was, now they could easily go on to acquire these slightly backward countries which were non-industrialized, to acquire their lands and gain control over them. So these explorations also facilitated acquiring colonies, leading to the rise of imperialism. Now, what was the result of this imperialism? There were certain negative impacts of this, and there were certain positive impacts of this. Let's see what were the negative impacts of imperialism. One, this imperialism led to acquisition of colonies and colonial rivalries. That all the industrial nations, they start acquiring more and more colonies, and they begin some sort of contest, race of acquiring more colonies. The nation that will acquire more colonies will be considered more powerful. So these colonial rivalries, they eventually led to the two world wars, the World War One and the World War Two. How the nations start to, in the race of acquiring new lands. So if one nation was, having an eye or tried to occupy the colony which was already occupied by another nation, it would lead to war between the two. Like in India itself, we saw the initial struggle. The Portuguese came here, the French came here and established their factories to gain control. But the Britishers, they were very strong. So they were Anglo French wars happening, Anglo Dutch wars happening here, and eventually British go on to establish their dominance here, and they acquire India as their colony. So these rivalries or wars began to happen between them, which eventually also led to the world wars. So this imperialism resulted in acquiring colonies, a race for acquiring more colonies, which eventually also has led to the world wars. Then it also led to the impoverishment of the Asian African countries. These non-industrialized countries, which were gained control by these industrialized nations, they were economically exploited, which led to their impoverishment. We see like example of our own nation, India, was highly economically exploited. Huge taxes were taken from people. People were made to buy their products, and they made huge advantage of the fact that they were stronger. So they did not work for the development of these colonies. So it further led to the impoverishment of the Asian and the African countries, as they were very much exploited by the imperialist nations for their own benefits. But there were certain positive impacts as well. We see that when these advanced nations, these industrialized nations came in these non-industrialized backward regions, they also introduced here system of transport and communication, so as to help themselves only, that now facilitate goods to be procured from here and taken to their own nation. They built the system of transport and communication, so these facilities became more efficient here. Then modern education system was also spread in colonies. The Western system of learning was introduced. Western modern education in science and technology, that was introduced in these colonies, backward regions. Besides that, advanced health facilities, postal system, telegraph system, railways, these all developments were also made by these imperialist nations in the colonies that they acquired. So it led to high-tech development, to a lot of development and modernization of these non-industrialized nations as well. So this was the positive side of the imperialism. Now, what was the particular impact of imperialism on South Asia? We see again that the South and Southeast Asia was entirely subjugated, gained control over by the industrialized nations, the powerful nations. It brought about modernization. Modern system of education was introduced. Finer health facilities were introduced. Transport system was made better. Postal facilities were made, healthcare facilities were made better. So it led to development and quite a lot modernization in these backward regions. Then second, it led to rise of nationalism. So when these imperialist nations came here and exploited the nations, so it eventually, as a reaction, people realized that these people are exploiting us. So they became united, forgetting their own internal differences. They united as a reaction against the imperialism and stood against them. That is when the nationalist feelings arose among the people. Like in the Indian freedom struggle, we see that people realize the Britishers are exploiting us. So they came up together in the freedom struggle, and this led to the rise of nationalistic feelings, led to rise of nationalism against the system of imperialism. So it led to this rise of nationalism in these Asian countries. Then we see that there was subjugation of South Asian nations. There was indirect imperialism in China. So there was not direct political interference or control over China, but there was indirectly controlling the trade and economic, making economic benefits out of China. So there was an indirect imperialism there. Indonesia was under the Dutch control. Sri Lanka was occupied by the Portuguese first, then the Dutch, and finally by the British. Burma, that is Myanmar, that also became a part of British Empire in India. France went on to gain control over Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. So these were the impact of imperialism on South Asia. So you should have a clear understanding what is imperialism, what were the benefits as to why these powerful nations go on to acquire colonies or subjugate these non-industrialized regions, what benefits they derived from it, what were the causes which led to it, and how did it actually have an impact.